Right now, as you're watching this video, something extraordinary is happening. You're not just seeing images and hearing sounds. You're experiencing them. You're aware that you're aware. You're thinking about thinking. But here's the question that has divided psychology for over a century and still remains unanswered. Is your consciousness simply the result of neurons firing in your brain, nothing more than biological machinery producing the illusion of an inner life? Or are you something more, something that transcends the physical flesh? Carl Jung risked his entire professional reputation to argue that consciousness extends far beyond the individual brain, connecting us to layers of reality that materialism cannot explain. Sigmund Freud dismissed these ideas as mysticism, and their friendship shattered over this very question. William James, the father of American psychology, spent his final years investigating whether consciousness could exist independent of the body. Today, we're diving into psychology's greatest and most controversial enigma. Are we more than flesh? And the answer might completely transform how you understand yourself. To understand this question, we need to go back to the birth of modern psychology in the late 19th century. Before psychology became a science, questions about consciousness, the soul, and the nature of human existence belonged to philosophers and theologians. Pioneers like Wilhelm Wundt and William James wanted to study the mind scientifically, to make consciousness itself a subject of rigorous investigation. This created an immediate problem. How do you scientifically study something that's inherently subjective, something that can only be experienced from the inside? Two camps emerged, and their battle would define psychology for generations. On one side were the materialists, psychologists who believed consciousness was nothing more than brain activity, that everything about human experience could eventually be explained by biology, chemistry, and physics. Behaviorists like John B. Watson and B. F. Skinner took this to the extreme, arguing that consciousness wasn't even worth studying because only observable behavior mattered. Watson famously declared that psychology should abandon all reference to consciousness and focus solely on stimulus and response. To these thinkers, you are your brain, nothing more. Your thoughts, feelings, and sense of self are simply byproducts of neural processes, evolutionary adaptations that helped our ancestors survive. On the other side stood psychologists who believed consciousness pointed to something deeper, something that couldn't be reduced to mere matter. William James, often called the father of American psychology, wrote extensively about the mystery of consciousness, and never fully accepted that it was simply a brain product. He investigated mediums, studied mystical experiences, and argued that consciousness might be more like a radio receiver than a generator, meaning the brain doesn't create consciousness, but rather filters or transmits it from some larger source. In his landmark work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, James documented hundreds of cases of transcendent experiences that suggested human consciousness could access realities beyond the physical. However, it was Carl Jung who took this furthest and paid the highest price for it. Jung started his career as Freud's chosen successor, his crown prince of psychoanalysis. Freud was firmly in the materialist camp, believing that consciousness arose entirely from biological drives and childhood experiences. Everything, according to Freud, could be traced back to intimate impulses and the conflict between our animal nature and civilized society. In contrast, Jung's clinical work kept showing him something else. His patients' dreams contained symbols and themes they couldn't have learned from their personal lives. They were tapping into something deeper, something universal. Jung called this the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche shared by all humanity, containing archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that transcended individual brains. When Jung proposed the collective unconscious, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He genuinely believed that consciousness extended beyond the individual, that we are all connected to something larger than ourselves. This wasn't mysticism or religion to Jung. It was empirical observation. He has seen it too many times in his practice. A patient who knew nothing of ancient mythology would dream of symbols that appeared in Egyptian texts. A child would draw images that matched alchemical manuscripts the child could never have encountered. People from completely different cultures reported remarkably similar visions during psychological crises. Jung's most controversial claim was that this collective unconscious suggested consciousness itself might not be produced by individual brains, but might instead be a fundamental feature of reality that individual brains access. Think of it like this: your radio doesn't create the music, it receives and translates radio waves that already exist. What if your brain works the same way? What if consciousness is like a field or dimension that the brain taps into rather than generates? This would explain why people can have profound experiences of connection, why symbols and meanings seem to exist independent of any individual mind, why consciousness sometimes appears to operate beyond the boundaries of the skull. Freud was horrified by these ideas. In 1913, after years of increasingly tense correspondence, their friendship and professional relationship collapsed. Freud saw Jung's theories as a betrayal of scientific psychology, a retreat into mysticism and superstition. Jung saw Freud's materialism as a closed door, a refusal to acknowledge the full depth and mystery of human consciousness. This split wasn't just personal drama. It represented psychology's central unresolved question. Are we just flesh, just brains producing the illusion of inner life, or are we something more? Jung spent the rest of his life developing his psychology of the transcendent. He studied alchemy, Eastern philosophy, world mythology, and religious mysticism, not as a believer but as a psychologist seeking patterns in human consciousness. He developed the concept of individuation, the process by which a person integrates all aspects of the psyche, including those that connect to something beyond the personal ego. He explored synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggested consciousness and matter might interact in ways that strict materialism couldn't explain. A patient would dream of a golden scarab beetle, and at that exact moment, an actual scarab beetle would hit Jung's office window, something so statistically improbable that it suggested a deeper connection between mind and world. Other psychologists quietly explored similar territory. Roberto Assagioli developed psychosynthesis, explicitly arguing that human consciousness has a spiritual dimension that connects to a higher self beyond the personality. Abraham Maslow studied peak experiences, moments when people felt connected to something greater than themselves, and argued that these weren't pathological, but represented the highest potentials of human psychology. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, developed logotherapy based on his observation that humans need meaning and connection to something transcendent, that we are meaning-seeking creatures who suffer when consciousness is reduced to mere biological drives. So what's the actual evidence that consciousness might be more than just brain activity? Let's look at what psychology has discovered. First, there's the phenomenon of the transcendent experience itself. Studies show that between 30 to 40% of people report having had at least one experience where their sense of self dissolved, where they felt connected to everything, where consciousness seemed to expand beyond the normal boundaries of the ego. These aren't just religious people or mystics. These are ordinary individuals who suddenly experience consciousness in a radically different way. Maslow studied these peak experiences extensively and found they were among the most meaningful, transformative moments in people's lives, often more impactful than years of therapy. Then there's the mystery of memory and identity. Neuroscience can show us which brain regions are active during memory recall, but it cannot explain the subjective continuity of self. You are not the same physical person you were 10 years ago. Almost every cell in your body has been replaced. Your brain has been constantly rewiring itself. Yet somehow, you experience yourself as the same continuous consciousness. Where does this continuity live? If consciousness is just neurons firing, and those neurons are constantly changing, what maintains the thread of your identity? Materialist psychology struggles with this question. Jung pointed to another phenomenon that's difficult to explain materialistically: the power of symbols and archetypes. Across all cultures and throughout history, certain symbols appear again and again: the hero's journey, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, the trickster. These patterns show up in myths, dreams, art, and religious traditions worldwide. If consciousness is purely individual, purely the product of each person's unique brain and experiences, why would these universal patterns exist? Jung argued this was evidence of the collective unconscious, a shared dimension of consciousness that transcends individual brains. Modern psychology has also documented phenomena that challenge strict materialism. There are the documented cases of terminal lucidity, where people with severe cognitive decline suddenly regain full consciousness and clarity just before passing, sometimes for hours. Their brains are not functioning coherently, yet consciousness somehow emerges fully formed. How? There's the research on near-death experiences, where people report coherent conscious experiences during periods when their brains show minimal or no activity. Materialist psychology says this should be impossible. If the brain creates consciousness, and the brain isn't functioning, there should be no experience at all. Transpersonal psychology, founded by Maslow, Grof, and others, studies these non-ordinary states of consciousness systematically. What they've found is that under certain conditions, through meditation, breathwork, or other methods, people can access states of consciousness that feel more real, more meaningful than ordinary waking consciousness. They report experiencing themselves as something beyond their individual identity, connecting to what they describe as universal consciousness, cosmic awareness, or divine presence. These aren't hallucinations or delusions. People come back from these experiences with lasting positive changes, reduced fear of the afterlife, increased compassion, and a profound sense that consciousness extends beyond the physical. If Jung and these other psychologists were right, if consciousness is more than just flesh, what does that mean for how we live our lives? The implications are staggering. First, it means that the materialist assumption underlying much of modern psychology and psychiatry might be fundamentally incomplete. We've spent decades trying to reduce all psychological suffering to brain chemistry, treating biological disorders to be managed with medication. And yes, medication helps many people, but it doesn't address the deeper question of meaning. If consciousness has a transcendent dimension, then psychological health isn't just about fixing altered brain chemistry. It's about connecting to something larger than yourself. This was Viktor Frankl's central insight from the concentration camps. He watched as captives who had a sense of meaning, a connection to something beyond their immediate suffering, were far more likely to survive than those who didn't. He saw that humans have what he called a will to meaning, a fundamental drive to find significance and purpose that goes beyond mere survival. When consciousness is reduced to flesh, to biological drives and chemical reactions, we lose access to this dimension of meaning, and psychological suffering intensifies. Jung believed that much of modern neurosis came from what he called the spiritual problem of modern man. We've disconnected from the symbols, myths, and practices that once connected human consciousness to something transcendent. We've embraced materialism and lost touch with the depths of the psyche. The result is a culture of people who have everything materially, but feel empty inside, who suffer from what Jung called loss of soul. The solution isn't to reject science or return to pre-modern superstition. It's to recognize that consciousness has layers and dimensions that purely biological psychology cannot address. This also changes how we think about passing away, arguably the most fundamental question of human existence. If consciousness is just brain activity, then when the brain ceases, you simply cease to exist. End of story. But if consciousness is something more, if it's connected to dimensions beyond the physical, then passing might not be an absolute ending. Jung was cautious about making definite claims, but he noted that the psyche seems to behave as if it's not limited by physical passing. Dreams of deceased loved ones, archetypal images of the afterlife appearing across cultures, the universal human intuition that something of us continues. These might not be wishful thinking but hints of something real about the nature of consciousness. It also transforms how we understand our relationships and our connection to others. If there's a collective unconscious, if consciousness at some level is shared, then we're not isolated individuals trapped in separate skulls. We're interconnected at the deepest levels of being. This explains phenomena that materialist psychology struggles with, like why we can sometimes sense what others are feeling, why groups can develop collective consciousness, why humanity shares certain universal values and intuitions. We're not just separate flesh machines programmed by evolution. We're expressions of a larger consciousness, individuated but not separate. How do we live if we take seriously the possibility that we are more than flesh? Jung offered practical guidance. First, pay attention to your dreams. They're not random neural noise, but messages from deeper layers of consciousness, communications from the parts of yourself that transcend the ego. Keep a dream journal, look for patterns and recurring symbols, engage with your dreams as you would with a wise teacher. Second, engage in what Jung called active imagination, dialoguing with the images, symbols, and figures that emerge from the unconscious. This isn't make-believe. It's a method for accessing the deeper layers of consciousness. Next, find practices that connect you to something larger than your individual self. This doesn't have to be traditional religion, though it can be. It could be meditation, time in nature, creative expression, service to others, anything that takes you beyond the narrow concerns of the ego and opens you to a larger dimension of experience. Maslow found that people who regularly had peak experiences, moments of transcendent consciousness, were psychologically healthier, more creative, more fulfilled than those who didn't. Also, take seriously the realm of meaning and purpose. Don't reduce your life to material success, pleasure-seeking, or the avoidance of pain. Ask the deeper questions. What is my life for? What am I called to do or become? What connects me to something beyond myself? These aren't luxuries for people who have solved all their practical problems. They're fundamental to psychological health and well-being. Explore the shadow, those aspects of yourself you've rejected or denied. Jung believed that wholeness, psychological integration, required acknowledging and integrating all parts of the psyche, including the dark, uncomfortable parts. When we deny the shadow, when we pretend we're only our conscious ego, we cut ourselves off from the deeper layers of consciousness where transformation happens. Last, recognize that psychological growth is ultimately spiritual growth. Individuation, becoming who you truly are, isn't just about adjusting to society or managing symptoms. It's about connecting to the deeper self, that aspect of consciousness that transcends the personal ego. It's about becoming a channel for something larger than yourself, whatever you want to call it, the collective unconscious, universal consciousness, the divine, or simply the deepest truth of what you are. The question of whether we are more than flesh isn't just academic philosophy. It's the most practical question you can ask because it determines how you live, how you face suffering, how you find meaning, and how you approach the afterlife. If you're just flesh, just a temporary arrangement of atoms that will dissolve back into nothing, then perhaps all that matters is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain during your brief flicker of existence. But if you're something more, if consciousness connects to dimensions beyond the physical, then your life has a different quality of significance. You're not just a cosmic accident, but an expression of something meaningful, something that perhaps continues in ways we can't fully comprehend. Carl Jung spent his entire career exploring this mystery, and he never claimed to have definitive answers. But he did offer this: the psyche is the greatest of all cosmic wonders. Whether consciousness is generated by the brain or whether the brain is a receiver for something larger, the fact that we can even ask this question, the fact that we're aware of being aware, that we can wonder about our own nature, this itself is extraordinary. You are either an impossibly complex arrangement of matter that became conscious, or you are consciousness itself having a human experience. You are far more mysterious and magnificent than you've been taught. The enigma remains unsolved, but perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Perhaps the mystery of consciousness is meant to be lived rather than solved, explored rather than explained away. What matters is this: you have the capacity for experiences that transcend the ordinary, for connections that go beyond the physical, for meaning that makes your existence something more than mere flesh and bone. If this exploration into the depths of consciousness resonated with you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who's wrestling with these big questions about existence and meaning. Your support allows me to keep diving into these profound topics and bringing you content that goes beyond the surface. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think consciousness is more than just brain activity, or are we simply sophisticated biological machines?